Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Pål Krogdahl and Ville This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Fintech Daydreaming. My name is Ville Sointu. I will be your host for today's episode. And of course, I'm joined as always with my good friend and co-host, Pål Krogdahl. Pål, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. It seems to be becoming a common theme for me to say I'm doing great, I'm good, I'm wonderful, life is fantastic, I'm happy. So maybe at some point in time I need to say, Villa, I am so depressed and bored. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. Life is horrendous, but I don't think I'll ever get there. So I'm good, fantastic, wonderful.
This is
another podcast episode.
We're recording on a Monday in October in Finland, so this is the closest you can get to depressed, I think, in terms of the timing, at least for the podcast. So if you're saying great today, I think it's going to be great in most of the days as well.
No, I completely disagree. The worst time in Finland is, middle of December. It is not now. Now at least you still have some daylight and it's sort of sensibly, if you're lucky, warm. It's when you get to sort of middle of December, or even worse, early February, or January, when it's dark, it's slushy, it's cold, it's miserable, no. Do not sit there and say that it's bad because it's October. And by the way, it's my birthday soon, so how dare you?
It's my birthday soon as well, but I'm not going to disclose exactly when because breach of private information. So no GDPR issues here. So good. So again, that's for the weather update here in Finland today. But because we are a fintech podcast, at least technically or on paper, I guess we should be talking about something more interesting as well. And in order to do that, we have a fantastic guest today. So welcome to the podcast, Elisabeth. How are you today?
I'm really good. And I believe we must share a common month for our birthdays because it's almost my birthday too.
Yeah, there are no coincidences, I guess.
It's the best month ever. So
I think we can all agree on that at least on this podcast today. But Elisabeth, again, good to have you here. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we get into the interesting conversation today?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm Elisabeth or Liz, whichever one. I am originally German, which the accent doesn't give away. Started out in a very corporate career, if you want, in life and pensions, and then moved into private banking, and then went into strategy consulting, did all of that, and decided, oh my God, couple of things. I really don't want to be part of a big corporate machine anymore. I want to do my own thing. And also I realized throughout my sort of career that the rich keep getting richer because we give them so much information and we give them so much advice, and women specifically get treated slightly differently by the banks. So in order to sort of fix that, I think I left the corporate bastion, whatever you want to call it, the castle. And I'm now co-founder of a small startup called Aila Money, which is on a mission to close the gender wealth gap. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wow. And now the audience is already hearing why we have you on the podcast today, because financial inclusion, financial literacy are big topics for us here in the podcast. Sometimes it feels like we talk every other day, we talk about embedded finance, and every other day we talk about those financial inclusion, equality kind of topics. So again, you're a perfect fit to this continuation of topics.
Great.
But we also have some promises to keep to our audience. And one of them is that we always do a joke in the podcast. So before we move into the serious topics that you just kind of started talking about there, do you have a joke for our audience today?
So I absolutely do, but I will caveat, we Germans, we are not known for our sense of humor. So this might very well fall completely flat.
Well, I can guarantee you this. There has not been too many good jokes in this podcast before. So if you're going to be consistent.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm glad. Average, consistent, always good. My joke is actually a question. Why can a snake not rob a bank?
No idea.
No idea.
Because they are unarmed.
That was
I
actually
don't know.
not too bad.
I don't know if you're being nice and laughing or if you're genuinely laughing.
That was actually good. That was good.
You built up all this tension about being a bad joke, so it's kind of maybe it's half like relief, and
Like, oh, she did that one. Okay, good. I'd love to turn the tables if I may, because I also often use an icebreaker.
yeah,
And I do this because when I speak to a lot of women specifically about money. And I mean, there's lots of statistics out there. I think we speak about sex more than we speak about money. Women are more comfortable speaking about death than they are about money. So one of the questions that we ask, just to bring the topic to life, is imagine your doorbell rang right now, right? And outside stood money personified. Who or what is standing outside of your door?
Paul, I'm going to give this to you first.
Well, actually, I'm instantly I'm torn because the man boy in me wants to say it's a Porsche 911 GT3 RS, but the reality of me would say the central bank.
Mm, I like it. I like it. So you can read into that if you want a little of there's a lot of fun and perhaps aspiration. I don't know if you drive a Porsche, and also rules and all of that kind of good stuff. What about you, Ville?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, my engineer's mind almost immediately went to, okay, what is the literal symbol of money? And to me, for whatever weird reason, maybe because I've been reading so much Donald Duck cartoons with Scrooge McDuck in my youth, that it's almost like this brown bag full of gold coins or whatever. But then once I kind of thought about that for a second, then I realized, well, that's not actually relevant for money that much anymore. So then it started going into, is there any form of digital money, some kind of a digital wallet, whatever that might look like. But again, between those two things, very concrete things. So not a person per se.
It's a great thing if you want to have a question at a dinner party. Break the ice on the subject because you will get some really funny answers, some really like great, funny, insightful answers. So there you
Yeah.
go.
There we go. Again, I did not realize I'm such a big Scrooge McDuck influenced person, but there we go. Anyway, thanks for that. I think we've never had this kind of turning the tables for the icebreakers. So glad to have some inconsistency in the podcast. Great. Okay, but hey, let's move on. We already started talking during our introduction a little bit about why you're here today, but maybe we start from Aila Money and what do you do there, and what is the problem you're trying to solve? I mean, it's
Yeah.
related to the things you already mentioned in gender equality and so forth. But can you tell us a little bit more about
Yes.
what you do?
Let me start with the problem because I think that's always the bit that I don't know. For me, it was like oh my God, really? When I started to read the numbers. So the gender wealth gap is going to take 7 generations to close, right? So that's not my daughters, that's not my granddaughters or yours. It's not your great great. Like you have to put 5 great before that is set to close. 170 plus years. The average woman that doesn't invest, somewhat of a high earner, will stand to lose up to $1 million. So that's about 700,000 Danish crowns throughout her career, right? By not getting advice, these are just some of the numbers that are out there. By not getting some sort of financial guidance or advice, you stand to lose up to 400,000 DKK every 10 years, right? And women are substantially less likely than men to do that. So for me, some of these numbers were like, oh my goodness, we want a seat at the table. We want the equality. I recognize there's a gender pay gap. I recognize that there's lots of problems, but there is this gap and we need to fix it, right? For women to really have that seat at the table. And so we at Aila are really trying to tackle that by putting a digital personal trainer for your finances in your pocket, right? And again, let me liken it to something that perhaps we're more used to in our daily life. We all have a goal of perhaps maybe one day running a marathon, losing 10 kilos, starting to go to the gym more regularly, right? So we have these sort of fitness or weight loss goals. And we often have, a little phone in our pocket that starts to give you oh, I should, today do the 10 squats. squats and tomorrow do the 20 push-ups and whatever in order to achieve them, right? Or maybe you should eat soya beans instead of whatever, right? In order to achieve your goal, right? So, and exactly in the same way, we help people understand where they are currently at with their money, right? So we use data to understand what's your income, what are your assets, what does that look like, what does that mean in terms of taxes? And then we help people calculate their dreams, right? So we actually put a number on people's personalized dreams. Do you want a family of 2 kids or 3 kids? Or do you want to buy a house? Do you want to retire at 55? Do you want to start your own business? Whatever. Everybody's dreams are different. But without knowing what that number is, it's really hard to know whether what you're doing is the right thing. So we help people understand where they are, we help them understand where they want to get to, and then we chart the way and like a good personal trainer, remind you, give you the learnings, give you the actions and the exercises, and then nudge you, right? So prompt you to say, hey, you said you were going to do X. I can see you haven't, or is there something stopping you, right? So we're really trying to personalize it, like hyper personalize it to that individual, to those dreams that that person has, and really ground it in their why. Because we keep going back to you're doing this because of the future life that you are imagining for yourself, which also means we're really bringing in that behavioral science angle in a way that many others aren't, because we're helping people understand the trade-off of today versus the future in a very different way. So yeah, that's us in a nutshell and how we're trying to tackle it.
Big questions. Paul, yes, please.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, at what age do you start? There are more and more financial institutions that are looking at onboarding children or the younger generation to be able to start that good behavior from a financial perspective as young as possible. Does that mean that you're doing the same?
So we actually have found through lots of research in the market and also speaking to lots of women that the normal age where people start to think about these dreams and goals is in their late 20s. Why their late 20s? It's because you've come out of university, right? With or without debt, depending on which country you've gone to university in. But typically you're like, first paycheck, amazing. Let me learn to manage a budget, right? And your finances are pretty simple at this point because you are getting money in and you just need to figure out, am I spending more than I am taking in? What starts to happen in your late 20s is you have more than one goal, right? You start to get to a place in your life where you go, okay, right. So I might be thinking about, and I'm just going to use some standard examples here. Again, they differ by person, but I might be wanting to get married, thinking about having kids, thinking about buying that house with my partner. And all of a sudden you're going, okay, my income, not only do I need to cover my expenses, but now I've got the complicated choice to make of which one do I focus on? Because if I want the big wedding and the kids, immediately, and the big house with the whatever deposit, etc., all of a sudden you're in a place where you're going, I can't cover all of those. So you need to make some choices, both about how you spend money now, but also how you start to save and invest. So we're finding that that's a really good age to engage with people because it's when your finances start to get more complicated.
Listening to what you're talking about the tools and the things you can do to make this financial life easier for your customers or users of your application, they sound to me fairly common for everybody. But maybe the question therefore is that what are the kind of core things you have identified specifically in the gender gap?
Yes.
That you're addressing that might be applicable for the underserved more than not?
So I think the way I look at it, there's really 2 or 3 things. One of them is that we take a lot of time to really simplify the language and make it appropriate with examples that work for women, right? At a level and also with examples. So we try and bring it back to the kind of expenses that they might have or the kind of life that they might lead, etc. Right? So that's number one. The second that we do a lot of, and this is very specific to gender, is there's lots of emotions and myths that happen, right? That we all have, but it appears, if we look at just the numbers on, say, investing, that women feel or have these blockers more so than men, right? So there appears to be more barriers. And in part, actually, that is related to gender because there's a stereotype of women can manage their budgets, but they can't really make the big financial decisions. That unfortunately has been well documented in research. It's also been it's been shown in research that, families speak to boys more about complicated finances, so anything that's not budget and saving, than they do to their girls, right? So even from a really young age, we're essentially, unfortunately, still teaching our girls, you can manage a budget. You can go spend the money as long as it's small amounts and you can save. The problem is that by saving, you're not going to be able to achieve your long-term goals, right? So we spend a lot of time really getting over those, helping people understand what is their risk? Why do they have this risk? What sort of emergency money do you need? And what sort of insurances might you want in order to really get comfortable to say, okay, now I'm going to start investing. And I'm going to invest for this goal because I can see that it's a really long way away, or actually the returns are going to be better than if it was in a savings account, etc.
But I think
Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say one of the things that we actually talk about quite a lot on the podcast and covered in depth with multiple guests is around the sort of decline of financial literacy in the younger generation in Europe, but potentially globally. And going back a little bit to what Villa said, I agree with what you're saying, that historically maybe we have treated girls and boys differently in how we educate them about financial management. But things have got so complex now. There are so many choices. There's so much variation, and there's fundamental uncertainty about the future with the geopolitical situation and changes in interest rates, etc. So, is that gap actually diminishing? Is there not a case these days that actually both boys and girls need the same support, advice, and guidance? Because most parents probably aren't educated enough. I'm sorry, we're probably going to get beaten up here, Villa, but most parents probably aren't even educated enough anymore to give good, strong financial advice to their children. They're just as lost and confused and scared themselves.
So I agree. I think there is a massive gap. I don't see it closing. I see there being huge space for financial education in schools, financial education in universities, financial education for like your first job, because these are all moments in your life where you should be learning certain concepts, right? I think for us, the way that we approached this problem was to say, by all metrics, pretty much, the women are worse off, right? The women, they are investing less, they feel less empowered about their finances, they have less confidence, there's a massive gender pension gap, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some systemic issues, right, around how the system is set up. But there's also then as I said, the individual and emotional issues. And so our view is, if we can fix it for the women, we don't exclude men. If a man would like to use the Aila app, we are not adverse to it. In fact, about 25% of our users are men. But we are looking at it as, if we're fixing the women issue, we're probably fixing a broader issue. Does that help answer your question?
No, absolutely, yes. Fantastic. I think what you're doing is fantastic. I'm just making sure, to a certain degree, we're not singling out one demographic over another, inadvertently. But I understand exactly what you're doing, and I agree. I've got two daughters, and I know a number of younger females that do struggle with the whole complexity of financial management and money management. So I agree.
So speaking of,
sorry, if I may, one of the things that I find is, when I talk to young men, they talk to each other about finances, right? It is a much more common and somewhat acceptable conversation to have. They might not be going, oh, I've got this much and therefore I invested this, or I get paid this much. They might not be doing that, but they're at least going, oh, you know what? I invested in X. I'm dabbling in Y. I'm looking at a mortgage and what sort of rates are you getting, right? Women don't have that conversation. I sit in a room with women regularly and start having this conversation, and they come out and they're like, that was the first time I've shared anything about my finances. Even the fact that I don't really feel comfortable with anybody, right? Because it's just not a common conversation to have. And I think therefore for me, there's therefore a big identity piece, right? If you don't feel that you can talk about it, then you're not that, there's this moment of like, I am a runner because I run. Even if I only run once, I have gone for a run. Does that make sense? Like I can then say I am a runner. So the same with like I manage my money. If I'm talking about it, if I've got people holding me to account to it or whatever, you then start to become that person much more. So it's opening that conversation up in a way that I do think is a bit different among the genders.
But I also think that's a generational thing. I grew up in the UK, and as a younger adult in the UK, it was always said money and sex is something you don't talk about, right? And I think we're starting to change that a little bit these days, but it's still to a certain degree a bit taboo to talk about money. You don't share with your friends how much you earn and those sort of things. And I think we need to break that down. Absolutely.
And I actually think the UK is doing a great job because they have got these metrics in as of a couple of years ago, which highlight, any company that has, I believe it's over 250 employees, have to publish their gender pay statistics publicly, right? Which means it's a much easier conversation to have because you then start to go, hey, I don't see myself in those statistics, or I'm like a complete outlier because those statistics are anonymous but available, right? So I give huge credibility and huge credit to the UK for having done that. So hats off. Sorry, I keep interrupting you, Ville.
No, that's okay. Again, this is a conversation between the three of us. So again, there's no no interrupting in this company. So the thing that just wanted to kind of just occurred to me when I was listening to you guys talk was that young men talking about finances in a funny way, even though in this podcast we are quite anti-crypto. The fact that cryptocurrencies have been such a fascinating phenomenon seems like a lot of especially young men, talk a lot about crypto, and maybe that's a learning journey for them too, because they need to maybe get burned by crypto, and then they will realize what actually is sensible way of managing our finances. But nonetheless, it brings these people to the world of finance for better or worse. Even though we would never recommend even looking in that direction in this podcast, but that's another story. Now, speaking of demographies, and Pål, you mentioned specifically Europe in a lot of the conversations that we've been having. So what is the scope of Aila Money? I mean, obviously, this gender gap situation is very different across different countries and regions in the world for various reasons. But how do you see this kind of global picture, and what parts of that are you addressing currently?
Yeah, so let me start with what we're addressing and then move into the global sphere in just a bit. So we are currently offering think of it as like a hyper-personalized solution in Denmark and in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say that is because every country's tax and product system is different. And so the ability to provide that really tailored guidance needs to be on a country by country basis. So concrete example, in Denmark, you have an aktiesparekonto, which is a fairly tax efficient way to save or invest, right? In the UK, it's ISAs. They're just two different products. Yes, the foundation of them is similar, but the tax implications are different. So you have to have different learnings, you have to have different, et cetera, guidance as to go with that. For other countries across Europe, we provide more generic guidance, right? So we can't go into then the tax in your country looks like this, and the specific product that you may want to consider for this goal in your life might be 1, 2, 3. That's much harder for us to do because they are different. So those two countries are what we currently covered. The others, we provide much more generic, but still personalized information and guidance. How do I see that problem globally? I mean, I have had the luck throughout my career to have worked across multiple different geographies. So I think I've lived in about 12 different countries, and probably not quite most continents, but at least a couple of them. And I think for me, what's interesting is there is a gap in all countries, right? And there's a gap in both how women get paid, right? So how much assets they have. And that's obviously pay, but that's also things like inheritance. That's how many women found companies. That's how many women. There's lots of components to that. But there's literally, I think in Europe, there's one country where the gender pay gap is inverted, and that's Luxembourg, last I checked, right? So, and I believe it's the only country in the world. Now, you could probably pull me up and fact check me on that. But essentially it's a problem everywhere. And then I've had the pleasure of living in places like India and also in China. What's really interesting there is that the education pattern is the same, right? So again, women are less financially educated because they're expected to make some of these decisions less than the men. However, overall as a society, I found that in both those countries, for instance, there was a much higher, call it risk appetite, so willingness to engage in things like the stock market or things like share ownership, etc. So there are nuances, but the big global trends are the big global trend. What I think is great is that women's wealth is growing higher than any other subpopulation at the moment, right? So there are more women earning more, there are more women going to university, there's more women creating companies, creating wealth, inheriting wealth, all of that kind of good stuff. So yeah.
It's interesting because financial services in general tend to be always hyper localized. People don't want to say that a lot of the fintechs who want to scale globally very fast would like to see that there's kind of a uniform market to address. But because we're dealing with things that are a lot related to trust a lot, I feel that there's always the trust component requires a very localized component. And it also applies into this case of financial literacy and basically advice that you are bringing into this specific segment right now. So it's fascinating to see this apply across the board. Also, one thing that occurred to me when you mentioned different markets and Luxembourg being the only place where this is inverted. Also, typically the women are less financially included or less financially literate for many reasons, like you mentioned. But there's one exception to this, and even though I don't want to generalize an entire continent here, but there is an element, especially in Africa, where the women are the ones who actually take care of the finances because the men are completely unreliable. So the men basically, in many cases, they are the ones who might go to the factory and work or be at the farm and work. But in order for them to provide for their family, they send the money to the lady of the house in order to make sure that they don't spend it in the absolute wrong ways.
But the interesting thing for me there, if I may, is to say, but how much of that money is put into things that will help the family grow their wealth, right? So women are, even in the West, I think I mentioned this sort of small money versus big money, and there have been research papers written on this. Managing budgets and managing the day-to-day finances and the sort of day-to-day purchasing decisions for the family is often left to the women, right? In family constructs. But it's the investment decisions, which in, emerging markets possibly doesn't look like the stock market, but looks like, either investing in more from everything from cattle and sheep to a new roof, right? Depending on what sort of income brackets we're looking at. But those decisions, I don't know enough, I have to admit, as to who's making those decisions in Africa. But I would venture to say that would not be done by the woman alone.
Yeah, you're right. The availability of this investment product in general, of course, is making it impossible to even learn about these things, even if you wanted to. So correct. I would agree with you that the lady of the house takes care that the family is provided for, they get the day-to-day things, but in how to actually grow that wealth is another step forward, I would believe. Of course, a lot of the mobile money providers are already doing interesting things like basic savings accounts, and then they have these community savings features that are quite unique to these emerging and financially underserved markets. But you're right. I think the education would help a lot in these regions as well, despite of the fact that this might be a little bit of a different hierarchy in the monetary things and than maybe here in the Nordics, for example. But yeah, we like to go a little bit techie sometimes here. We don't need to do that today to the extent that we geek out sometimes because that's quite deep and boring maybe. So But walk us through. I mean, how does the Aila Money application work? So what do I do if I'm interested in this? What happens? How do I sign up? And then what is the day-to-day life like with Aila application? And then if we can use that as the bridge to maybe explain a little bit, how do you achieve the things that you do with the Aila Money app?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've mentioned that we're pretty early stage. So let me start with the MVP that we put together, which is what we started as, and which we sort of tested our entire thesis with, right? I'll talk about the app in just a minute as well. And the reason is because it's sort of I think it's quite a fun and crazy entrepreneurial story as well. So we went out and asked a bunch of women, 200 in a questionnaire, and then talked long form interviews. What is it that you want, et cetera, all of these kind of good things. And they said, we'd love for some learning, for these insights, et cetera. So we said, great, how do we test this? How do we test this basic, no code, low code, et cetera, all good stuff without doing crazy development, without just to get a sense of whether people wanted to do this? Essentially, what we came up with was a questionnaire, so a type form, right? Really basic. You provide static data, and then you go on a WhatsApp journey. I mean, it's that basic. You get WhatsApps that's personalized to you, to your current situation, to your numbers, to your dreams, and people receive those 3 times a week, right? And could pause and could ask whatever questions, and the question asking became less automated, right? Then we would have to jump in, etc. But you get a sense. So it was pretty, fun, and got us to really get a sense of what worked and what didn't work, because it really allowed us to be super close to the user. Like, we were getting emojis, we were getting instant reactions, we were getting votes and polls and all of that, right? So we tested and changed, etc. We're currently taking that and building the app, right? Which will again help collect static data and then provide this kind of functionality, but in a much more slick application format, right? The goal is to move into open banking and open finance, so that we can actually take not just the static data that people give, but then hyper personalize it to their investment accounts, their bank account, their everything else, right? Then we can add a layer of machine learning on top. The other thing we're already starting to explore, because we're working with several universities in the UK, so London School of Economics and City University, is how we can create a private version of an LLM that picks up on the tone of voice that people are looking for, right? So less just the educational component, less the Q&A and bot, but recognizing that I might want to be spoken to in a different way to you, right? Because I might have everything from more wealth and different dreams to also just a different attitude towards money, right? So what we're finding is that certain users are like, honestly, just tell me what I need to do, give me my to-do list, and I will work through it. And the only thing I need from you is to chase me and remind me. And if I haven't done it, to sort of go, come on, right? Whereas others are they need much more support. So same sort of message. Here's some of the things that are suggested. You've had a child, you need to change the beneficiaries on your pension form. Have you done this? Do you understand why you need to do this? Can I walk you through it again? Another nice reminder. Same message, genuinely same message, different tone, right? And people respond differently to it. So that then starts to bring in the large language model component that we're looking at for sort of future developments. So yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
There's another part to this, as I listened to you sort of going through this journey, sort of starting with using WhatsApp and that sort of reach out. Fantastic journey. I love that whole concept. It's very point to point. And one of the things that I'm listening to, and I was hoping you were going to bring up, was the fact that potentially there's the ability to build communities around this, where if you're looking at young women, they're all in the same demographic. They're women, they want to socialize. They maybe want to listen to others that are in a similar situation. I see a fantastic opportunity here for creating some sort of community-based, I'm saving, so am I, we're both saving, let's compare, let's compete, let's add an element of gamification into this. Maybe I've stolen some of your future roadmap here, but
I just didn't mention it. So yeah, we do that. So we have a coin-based scoring system that every time you log in and every time you sort of start doing your learnings, you collect coins, right? And then you can actually use those coins for different things. One of the things that we offer on the app, again, I haven't touched on this hugely, is we recognize that sometimes an app is not enough, right? So there are moments in your financial life where you go or even in your, I likened it to running a marathon. There comes a point when you're like, I just need a human. I just need a human personal trainer, right? And so we have people on a panel, coaches, as well as then advisors. And for people who aren't in finance, essentially the key difference is one of them is not regulated and the other one is highly regulated, right? So some people just want someone to hold them to account. Have you done your pension stuff? Have you done whatever, right? That's a coach versus the advisor, which might be a tax advisor, a wealth manager, pension advisor, you name it, right? So we have a panel there. And then that community piece, what we're doing is we're still testing this out on WhatsApp because, as you know, building apps, etc. But we combine people who have the same life goals, right? So if you come to me and say, I'm saving for a house or I'm about to start a family, you're probably in the same boat. And so we're putting people together and then curating those conversations. Because we actually absolutely recognize that that's part of the motivation and part of the, healthy competition, guidance, motivation, sharing, whatever that we do think needs to happen.
It's really interesting. I'm actually going to point this at you, Ville, but in all of the discussions that we've been having around embedded finance and the growth of platforms around banking, this is one of the areas where we keep bringing up with, the old traditional banks. You're missing out great opportunity in building a close relationship with your customers and around giving this advisory capability. It's not about just bringing in AI. It's about actually finding a way of having a hybrid AI human. And I think you've partially solved that problem. I'd like to stick up a big sign to all the traditional banks and say, look here, this is how you do it, right?
Yeah, no, do you know what? I think it's because both my co-founder Nithika and I have had that, right? So we've done a lot of our finances digitally. We're sort of that first generation to have grown up with the banking apps and all of that, right? And we've seen the evolution and we've seen some of these, players in the market that have just entered from the big ones, obviously the Revoluts or in the UK, the Nutmegs or whatever. Here, the Plios and the Lunars and the everything else. But when push comes to shove, so I have moved country, right? So I have moved to Denmark and I got here and I said, I need to understand how taxes work. And I need to understand that from my situation, not on the SCAT website. Because I love the SCAT website. It is actually pretty good, but I still don't understand exactly how it applies to me. So yeah, I went to a tax advisor, right? Because for me, that was a moment in my life where I just went, it's not something I'm willing to get wrong. It is something I'm willing to pay for. And I want a human to tell me because I feel like then I can also ask all those questions, etc. So yeah, that's what we're really trying to do. And then also with all the information that we gather in future, the idea is to say, okay, actually, can we already provide that information to be it the mortgage advisor, be it the pension advisor, be it the tax person, etc.
So, Paul, since you already painted me in the gray-bearded, boring, traditional banker corner, let me double down on that a little bit. So, the things we're talking about here, again, mentioned already, financial advice, personal data, even large language models. Of course, the question becomes, I mean, what is your stance towards supervision regulation, and maybe have you learned any lessons along the way about how you want to be maybe supervised and some things that you might want to avoid in the future?
Yeah, so I think both my co-founder and I have spent a combined 30 years in finance. So we know how and why regulation works and exists. And it's really important to have regulation because we're dealing with people's not just money, but their data, right? And for me, those two are pretty powerful things to be dealing with, right? So against that backdrop, the way that we look at it, and I think what we're seeing in general, and specifically in the UK, is there's a sort of gray area at the moment around what is guidance and what is advice. So what we don't do is advice. That is why we have humans where we go, you now need to speak to the tax person. Like I can explain the tax system to you and I can explain the implication of a product and the tax, but I cannot tell you for your exact situation what your tax liability is and etc. Then you need to, I'm just using tax as an example. That's why we have humans that we work with. What you are seeing though, is in the UK, and I see the FCA as sort of being at the forefront of most regulatory things across Europe, is that they are looking again at what does guidance and what does advice mean, right? Because they're finding after some changes that they made, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the retail distribution review, that people are not getting financial advice anymore. And therefore they are losing out on lots and lots of money because they aren't making the right sort of choices, because they aren't making any choices and because they aren't making the right choices, right? And so one thing that we're seeing is this ability to move slightly closer to advice is something that is happening. And I think machine learning and AI and all of that, the technology will allow us to move there also in a way that is somewhat more controlled, because you can then say, well, if the algorithm says X, or if, you know, the rule in the rule-based, time-based prompt system says Y, then we should still be within the bounds of what's possible. So I think that would be my general statement there. We operate in the guidance space. I do see that moving slightly more towards the ability to personalize. And I think that hyper-personalization is what's needed to also prompt people to action, right? To actually get them to do something. Yep. Just, you know, when I love this, right? At the end of the tax year, it's like, oh, you think about topping up your pension. Great. Yeah, but that's a nice reminder. If somebody said, you still have exactly this many Danish crowns before you've topped up your Ratepension, go, right? Like, and I can see that it's available in this account. Do you want to just do it because it'll be more tax efficient? I think you've got people way more likely to go, okay, yeah, I'm good, go.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of last week, Paul, when I was trying to advise you on how to do pensions in Finland. So maybe this would have been helpful for you as well. Closer than you think.
Well, you mean the one where I said to you, I can't find the information. You said, how about look at the title that has the information in it? Is that the one you're talking about?
Exactly. That is personalized pension advice, or guidance in this case, I would say. Well, anyway, completely agree, and I think this brings up the localization angle once again. So again, having the local advice, relevant advice, is always the thing that is almost like required in order to establish this trust, in order to be effective in these spaces. We have too many of these generic models, like we established earlier already in the conversation. I'm starting to maybe round off the discussion today a little bit, but before we get there, I mean, one of the things, of course, is that we want to make, because we have a lot of fintechs listening to this podcast. Would you have any advice to other fintechs in order how to make their products and their services more inclusive?
I mean, the really obvious one is just, if that's what you would like to do, go speak to the women and ask them what they want. And often it's then putting something in front of them, having them test it. Like that's why we started with WhatsApp, right? It was literally to go, and we got some amazing feedback. You talk about estate planning and you expect me to know what that means. Please explain it to me. Okay, great, right? Like because you come when you're in an industry, right? Which I think everyone who works in fintech you come with an assumption that people know what you know and that people act like you act. And so if you're trying to really cater to an audience, and if you are trying to be inclusive, make sure that you are designing for your customer, right? Make sure you are putting it in front of them and getting that feedback and listening to that feedback. That would probably be my key advice on how to become inclusive.
Couldn't agree more. Sometimes, especially when you're dealing with kind of these technology first type of entrepreneurs, that part of the equation is sometimes missed, and that's part of the reason where we are here, where we are today. So, exactly. Smart advice.
And there's a great book, if anybody wants to read it, called Invisible Women, which I don't know if you guys have come across, but it really highlights exactly that problem, that the world is designed around whoever is designing. There's a great example in this book, and I'm going to take it, if I may, take
Yeah.
2 minutes, where in Sweden, they designed in whatever, in the 1960s, how in winter the snowmobile that like puts out the salt and the grit and clears the roads. This how this happened was designed by men. And so the men went and said, well, I live in a house and I go to work, so I take the small road to the big road, and then I go off the big road to the small, like to get to my office. So we need to clear the big roads because everybody's on the big roads, right? And logical sense, of course. What they then did when they reviewed this in the early 2000s and they included women on the design panel was to go, oh, funny that the women and the old people go from their house down the really small road to the kindergarten, the school, and then down the really small road to work, and then to the really small road to the supermarket, and then down back to the kindergarten and all of that. Who's more likely to fall over because they're on bikes or they're walking and the roads haven't been cleared? And therefore, more people were breaking their wrists and their hips on these small roads, right? So hospital bills were really high. And lo and behold, they just flipped it. They literally just flipped and started clearing the small roads before they cleared the big roads. And their hospitalization costs went really down, like went crazy down, because all of a sudden they were clearing the roads that actually people were using because they just had an inclusive design system, right? Sorry, it's a random example, but I think it shows really nicely how when you're stuck in your world, you will of course design for you. That's normal, right? But you have to understand, I'm not a man. I'm also not an old person yet. I am no longer a child. So if that's what I'm designing for, I have to go and speak to those people and include them in the design process.
User-centric design, I think is what they call it.
No, exactly. But this book really shows, especially for women, how they haven't been, right? So, and give some great examples. So there you go.
Yeah, so we're going to add the link to that book in the show notes in case you're interested in reading it. I definitely will add this to my reading list because, again, it's a fantastically interesting topic that we've been talking about today. And I think based on the example alone, it sounds like something I might want to look into as well. But good. Again, moving towards the end of the discussion. So what's next for you, Elisabeth and Aila Money?
So lots of users on the app that's launching in several weeks, and then from there we will obviously look for funding, and then that connection into open banking, open finance, and all those lovely AI machine learning things that I was starting to talk about. That's the plans with Aila. We do want to then sort of look at what markets we also go into next, because we recognize, as we've talked about, that sort of 80% of financial guidance is the same, but then those extra 20% do require that personalization and that localization. That's really the plan at the moment, and we're really excited to obviously launch and start getting going.
Fantastic. Looks like interesting times ahead. Paul, did you have any more questions or something to add before we end it today?
No, I don't think so. I think it's been a fantastically good discussion. I actually already know of a number of potential customers for your platform, hoping for you to launch in Finland. I will definitely get you some users if you do. And well, really good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I can only add that I can also give you at least a few customers that I can think of almost immediately from my own circles. So again, fantastic discussion. Thank you for coming on. Where can people find out more about you and Aila Money if they want to get in touch?
So the easiest way is ailamoney.com, AILA money.com. We also have an Instagram handle and a LinkedIn profile on that name. So have a look there. If you want to get in touch, it's hello@ailamoney.com. And then I'm obviously Elisabeth Prager on LinkedIn.
All right. And you can find me and Pål in the usual places. We've been mentioning that so many times, we don't need to mention anymore. The usual platforms, Fintech Daydreaming is easy to find in any of the podcasting platforms. So once again, Elisabeth, thank you for coming on. It was a really great discussion, hopefully eye-opening for many of our listeners as well as it was for us today. So with that being said, as usual, like, subscribe, comment, share the podcast with other friends. This was a good example of an episode that maybe the people who don't usually even listen to this podcast might benefit from. So please do that, and please engage on all the socials as usual. We love their comments. We love to be in touch with our listeners, and looking forward to meeting you also in many of these upcoming fintech conferences during this year. With that being said, we will be signing off today, and this has been Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.